In this lecture, we're going to go over how muscles contract. The name for the way muscles contract is called the sliding filament theory. So activation by nerves, which we talked about in the last lecture, cause the myosin heads of the thick filaments or cross bridges to attach to binding sites on the thin filaments or actin. Myosin heads then bind to the next site of the thin filament and pull them towards the center of the sarcomere, towards that bare zone. This continued action causes a sliding of the myosin along the actin, and this occurs at every sarcomere across the entire muscle, and that result is that the muscle is shortened or contracted. So in this diagram, you can see that there's a muscle at rest in image A, and we know that the muscle is at rest because that H zone or that bare zone does not contain any actin filaments. When a muscle contracts, as it does in diagram B, you can see that the actin has been pulled towards the bare zone or the H zone and has shortened the muscle. And since this occurs at each sarcomere, and there are many sarcomeres the length of the muscle, it causes the entire muscle to get shorter. When a muscle is at rest or relaxed, there is a protein complex that binds to the myosin binding sites on the actin so that the cross bridges do not form, and that allows the muscle to be at rest and prevent the muscle from contracting without stimulus. When a muscle is stimulated to contract and calcium is released, it activates the movement of the proteins that are on the surface of the actin, and it moves them away from the binding sites for the myosin heads. This way, the myosin heads can attach to the actin filaments, and then contraction can start to occur. The myosin heads have kind of two positions. So there's when they're straight and then when they're cocked or slightly bent. And so those myosin heads are able to bend and pull the actin fibers towards each other. And they use this using ATP. That's the energy that releases and recocks each myosin head, and every time ATP is able to reactivate a myosin head, it can pull those actin filaments towards each other, and that causes the muscle to get shorter and shorter. When a muscle cell is stimulated, it's kind of an all or nothing response. Within the skeletal muscle, not all fibers have to be stimulated during the same interval, however. That's like we talked about earlier. If you're going to pick up a piece of paper, you don't need to activate as many muscle fibers as you would if you were going to pick up a 20-pound weight. So the task that you are asking your muscle to do determines the number of muscle fibers that need to be activated. And different combinations of muscle fibers can give differing responses. And there's something called graded responses, and that's different degrees of skeletal muscle shortening. And we'll talk about some of those things in just a moment. A graded response can be produced by changing either the frequency of muscle stimulation or the number of muscle cells being stimulated. And that way you don't have the same exact contraction as a reaction to every stimulus. Because each stimulus that you encounter probably requires a different number of muscle fibers or frequency of muscle fiber stimulation in order to execute the movement that you're trying to do. So a twitch is a single brief contraction. This is not a normal muscle function. This usually does not happen volitionally, but it could happen because of a reflex, or if you have a lot of stress, you might have a twitch that happens, like if you have a muscle in your eye or something that starts to twitch. Those are just short, single brief contractions. When a twitch occurs, a stimulus is applied, that's indicated here by the pink arrow, and then the tension on the muscle goes up and then down, and then the contraction is done. That was the entire arc of the muscle contraction. Another type of graded response is the summing of contractions. So one contraction is immediately followed by another, so your muscle receives multiple stimuli consecutively, and the muscle does not completely return to a resting state due to more frequent stimulations. And so this causes the effects of contraction to be added. So when summing of contraction occurs, the muscle can put additional tension on because the stimuli have been close enough together that the muscle does not completely relax, and so you can have more tension or more kind of strength emitted by the muscle. Another type of graded response is unfused or incomplete tetanus. So this occurs, it's essentially a longer term summing of contractions, right? So some relaxation occurs between contractions, but nerve stimuli arrive at an even faster rate than during the summing of contractions. So unless the muscle contraction is smooth and sustained, it's said to be unfused tetanus. And when we look at it on the graph on the next slide, you'll see that the stimuli comes in more quickly between nerve impulses, and so the muscle can again add additional strength. So here you can see again that the stimuli are now closer together and more frequent, and so the tension of the muscle can add, but there is still relaxation between the stimulus arriving. And then finally there's fused or complete tetanus, and this shows no evidence of relaxation before following contractions, and the frequency of the stimulation that comes from the neurons does not allow for relaxation at all between contractions. So this results in a smooth and sustained muscle contraction. So when a muscle is experiencing fused or complete tetanus, the stimulus arrives and then continues to arrive so close together that the tension on the muscle remains constant until the stimulus ends. When a muscle is responding to strong stimuli, the muscle force depends upon the number of fibers stimulated. So if you, again, picked up a pen, fewer fibers would need to be stimulated than if you picked up, like your dog or something. And more fibers contracting together results in greater muscle tension. And muscles can continue to contract unless they run out of energy. So if you run out of glucose or an ATP supply, then muscles can start to fatigue. And we'll talk more about that in another lecture.